When discussing the legacy of Street Fighter, the EX series often feels like a hidden gem overshadowed by its iconic 2D counterparts, even more so after the release of Street Fighter 4 and beyond. While this is the case, in my opinion the Street Fighter EX series deserves its place in the spotlight as a bold, experimental chapter in Capcom's storied fighting game history, and the later release of its successor, Fighting EX3. Developed in collaboration with Arika, these spin-offs broke ground by transitioning the franchise into the world of 3D graphics for the first time, blending familiar Street Fighter mechanics with innovative gameplay elements that influence the genre for years to come. Beyond the visual leap, we met now beloved cult classic characters, whose cult following persists to this day, so in my opinion these games are more than worthy of celebration. Though these games may not have reached the same heights of popularity as the mainline titles, the Street Fighter EX series remains a fascinating piece of fighting game history, one that dared to innovate while staying true to the series' competitive spirit. So holding these thoughts, join me as we look back at all the EX games and commemorate their legacy, and look at what each title contributed. Hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here. This is the criminally underrated Street Fighter EX series. Games that deserve respect. Yeah. Street Fighter 2, it is bloody wonderful, isn't it? As well as most Capcom sprite-based fighters of the 90s. Thankfully, as of today, I can allow you to experience many of these all-time greats for next to nothing using my affiliate link. How about 24% off the brand new Marvel vs Capcom Arcade Collection, or the amazing Capcom Fighting Collection, which includes so many favourites for just $6.77. That's 85% cheaper than on Steam. In fact, I can even get you a 48% discount on Street Fighter 6, as well as the game's Year 2 Season Pass, which unlocks End Bison and more. Get huge discounts on thousands of AAA, modern, retro and indie games, all by using my Instant Gaming affiliate link, so happy shopping! If you can think back to the latter portion of the 90s, stylistically this period was edgy in more ways than one. This was the heyday of the popularity of the Attitude Era of the WWF, Jerry Springer, South Park, and of course, blocky polygonal graphics. Nothing was more edgy than these sort of renderings. This would mean that every franchise under the sun was trying to make a successful transition to 3D. It was a sink or swim time in history, with intellectual properties like Mario flourishing and the likes of Earthworm Jim suffering a painful death. So basically, sometimes these jumps worked out great, and in other cases, not so great. So where does Street Fighter EX fall in this regard? Well, let's discuss. During the period where gaming was going through this graphical paradigm shift, it was quickly becoming clear that sprite-based games were seemingly becoming a relic of the past. So for Street Fighter to survive as a brand, Capcom had no choice but to make the jump, right? Well no, not in Capcom's opinion at least. As far along as 1997, after games like Mario 64 had set the world on fire and Virtua Fighter and Tekken had made waves in the fighting game arena, Capcom would make the decision to make their next mainline entry in the Street Fighter series, Street Fighter 3, a traditional sprite-based fighter, which raises the question why. In regards to the choice to make the game 2D, general producer Noritaka Funamizu explained, "We feel that 3D is not really suitable for the head-to-head fighting, and to be frank, Capcom doesn't really have the techniques to display high-quality graphics in 3D. In many ways, Funamizu was correct, as all of Capcom's arcade hardware at the time was engineered to run sprite-based games, and Street Fighter 3 would be developed to run on their CP System 3 arcade board, allowing them to program one of the most technically impressive sprite-based games that had ever been seen, but it wasn't necessarily something the general consumer base were looking for at that time. Due to a number of reasons, including the one I just mentioned, Street Fighter 3 was not a popular game in the 90s, and as a result, it wasn't the cash cow Capcom had hoped for. Still, Capcom would defend their decision to remain mostly making 2D fighting games, on the grounds they believed that the hitboxes could be made more accurate, and button response times could be made quicker, so for competitive play at least, they felt this was the best direction to go in. Still, this didn't stop the likes of the Tekken series in terms of sales absolutely obliterating Street Fighter 3. Along with the Alpha Series 2 for that matter, which was being released on the CP System 2 hardware simultaneously. Contrary to this though, polygon-based Street Fighter games would end up being released through this era anyway, with the first of these of course being known as Street Fighter EX. But this still raises another question. How was this possible when Capcom had also said that they were not confident when it came to making a polygonal Street Fighter game? Well, outsourcing would come in, of course. Street Fighter EX was brought to life due to Capcom forming a working partnership with a company known as Arika. Now, what makes Arika interesting is that the company was founded in 1995 by a gentleman known as Akira Nishitani, the very same man who had previously played a big role in the development of Street Fighter 2, even designing many of the characters. So therefore, in terms of character design at least, an argument could be made that the EX follow-up to Street Fighter 2 would be the most faithful successor to the classic yet, and my god would it introduce some cool characters, but we would get to discussing those soon. Joining Nishitani working on the project would be Junicho Ono, who would serve as head of planning at Arika, and Ichiro Mihara, who would be a development supervisor and head of PR. Back in an interview with Gamis Mook in 1997, they would outline information regarding the game's development. With regards to that critical jump to 3D that we had previously touched on, Nishitani outlined some of the challenges the team would go through to achieve this goal, stating, "The thing that gave us the most trouble until the very end of development is handling two objects colliding, how they should push each other back, relative positioning, that sort of thing. In a 2D game, if you get pushed laterally, you just move laterally, but when you're dealing with 3D objects, if you have to think in terms of if you get hit like this, you move like this, just as a movement along the Z-axis, this game plays similar to a 2D one, with a horizontal view of a 3D space. So figuring out how to set that force was a struggle. Their movement is analog and their geometry changes. Controlling all of this was way more strenuous than we had expected, and we worried about it right up until the very end. Unfortunately, we ultimately came to the conclusion that it's impossible to make something in 3D that works exactly the same as something in 2D. Despite the challenges, the company would soldier on, and Street Fighter EX would actually mark Arika's first ever game. It would be produced to run on the Sony ZN hardware. This was extremely sensible hardware to make the game for, as whilst the Capcom boards were not a suitable home for the polygonal game, the Sony ZN hardware was pretty much perfect due to the fact that it was based on the Sony PlayStation's architecture, meaning that porting the game to the then most popular game console ever would not be a problem either. As mentioned earlier, Street Fighter 3 was programmed to use a lot of 2D sprite animation frames, which was perfect for the Capcom System 3 arcade board, but no use for home consoles at the time, particularly the PlayStation, which generally struggled with intense 2D gaming. This is evidenced by how poorly the Capcom vs series ports run on the PlayStation, which we have already covered on here recently. So now we have discussed how a 3D Street Fighter game was possible despite Capcom stating otherwise, I guess we had better begin discussing the game itself. Like most games that carry the name Street Fighter, the game is obviously a head-to-head fighter. The game was of course the original title in the series to feature 3D polygon graphics predating the likes of Street Fighter 4 by a number of years. The first mainline Street Fighter game which would opt to have a graphical style like this. In this game, polygon-based fights take place on a 2D plane, similar to that of Tekken and other games of the same ilk. Arika set out with the intention for this game's mechanics to be similar to Street Fighter 2 and the Alpha series, with the only major change being the actual polygon visuals. The thinking behind this was to release a game that looked visually impressive, whilst maintaining the same legendary gameplay long-term fans had loved and adored. But outside of the well-known mechanics that everyone was already familiar with, there was still some tweaks here and there that were implemented in an attempt to further make this game stand out. Changes of course included the character's roster itself, which would mix familiar faces from Street Fighter 2 with completely new characters with original design concepts. Icons such as Ryu, Ken, Chun-Li, Guile and Zangief all make very welcome returns, but perhaps the most alluring thing about the EX series today are all the weird unique characters who would not make it to later entries from the franchise, which is a huge shame as some of these are bloody marvellous. Out of all the new members we have Crackerjack, a former bouncer from Vegas who wields a baseball bat, Doctrine Dark, an American-German mercenary who is seeking revenge against Guile, Bullenperna, the daughter of an Arab billionaire, and Hokuto, who trains in her family style of martial arts. But by far the best of all of these is Skullomania, a ridiculous third-rate businessman from Tokyo who works to support his wife and children, but also chooses to fight crime and take part in martial arts tournaments from behind the mask, concealing his identity. This Kamen Rider inspired maniac is my favourite, and his theme tune is epic. Have a quick listen. perfection. To bolster this roster, there are also a further few secret characters and the final boss battle with Bison, all in all giving the title a fantastic roster of fighters to choose from. On the subject of the roster, we could learn about the fighters that were chosen for the game firsthand from those who created it. Nishitani adds, I'd say the choices we made felt like inevitability. If you look at the character select screen, you get the idea. Ryu and Ken are protagonists, so they already had a role to fill. They're the easy to use characters. And then for big bodies we have Zangief, and we needed a female character so we added Chun-Li. It was like that. And then from a gameplay perspective there are also charged characters. And because people are more familiar with Street Fighter 2, we decided that we should go with Guile over Charlie. We wanted to fill the game with characters who are, from a gameplay perspective, very distinct. Our aim was to have the game as a whole reflect that concept. The old development interview even gives us an insight into the new characters who were created for the game too, such as Crackerjack. Nishitani comments that we had pretty much settled on his design from the start, though it actually preceded us figuring out what his gameplay would be like, so we had some trouble coming up with that part. Midway through development we realised he didn't have much in the way of distinct characteristics, so we decided to make him an all-out type character. We brainstormed all sorts of ideas and it escalated into a huge fist and taken out a bat. In terms of this quirky lineup, many who have experienced the EX games will be able to remember the sinister Doctrine Dark. With Nishitani outlined that from the very beginning we wanted to have some kind of dirty fighter, and gradually worked on his design. We figured out his moves after that. Ono adds he's more of a secret military force type guy, but he wanted to have a ninja style character in some way or another. We went back and forth on it and settled on giving him SWAT-esque elements. Then from there decided we should give him a weapon, and because the original concept was a foul play character, we figured it was okay to give him bombs and other underhanded attacks, and that's how he took the form you see now. In terms of my personal favourite, Skullomania, Nishitani adds he was originally designed to be a tricky character to play, so he's changed a bit since then, but he was always Skullomania. The team joked that prior to fleshing the character out more, at first he looked really rubbery and S&M like, leading to the whole team not being fond of him, with Mihara stating in his heart of hearts he still hasn't fully accepted Skullomania. Ono comments though that he still wanted to bring the character to life one way or another, so consulted with the designers to come up with a look for him that they could all agree on. Ideas like a bone themed design came together and coalesced into his current look. He looks like a fighter and in his brain he's a fighter, but he's mistaken about being a hero. That's the gist of his character. Street Fighter 2 characters all had personal backgrounds, but you never really felt like you had that much of an understanding of them as people. I think that's just how it is with game characters. But we wanted Skullomania to be someone with a perfectly normal life in a similar position to all of us, which makes him all the more interesting. The idea was that he had a fight on the way to the store, transformed, and then when the fight was over, he returned home while still transformed. In terms of the fighting mechanics, special moves and super combos both make a return, along with a super meter. However, this game differs in the fact that the gauge is split into 3 sections rather than just levels, which is unique to the EX series. There is also a cool function in the game known as the guard break, which is a type of move that makes your opponents dizzy if you use this style of attack against one of your opponent's blocks. This varies from guard breaking in alpha, as it allows you to stun your adversary. It packs a cool punch and can be very satisfying to pull off. Nishitani in the past has commented on the implementation of this guard break system, adding, they were there right from the beginning. Things like turtling and set play have become much more hot topics in fighting games than we had expected, so we wanted to go full force against that by adding something radical to the game. At a mechanical level, we wanted to trend players towards taking action, and blocking in fighting games is typically a pretty all-powerful tactic. From the days of Street Fighter 2, there was this idea that as long as you're blocking, you can't be defeated, becoming a particularly valued tactic among skilled players. So we tried to consider how we could modify the concept of blocking so that it could be circumvented. One of the main ways was with throws, but throws have this fundamental perception of being cheap. Regarding this perception, he adds, I've seriously thought about it myself quite a few times, and the conclusion I come to is that throws are fundamentally cheap. There's something that feels dishonest about them, just by nature of being a throw. But we wanted to clarify that's just part of the rules of fighting games, so that's partially where guard break come in. In regards to the critical reception this now overlooked game would receive, Next Generation would provide coverage. The publication questionably looked at this game as somewhat of a failed attempt to bring the Street Fighter franchise into a 3D environment, with them stating, while the characters are evenly balanced and have a handful of innovative moves, the game plays more like a distant cousin to the Street Fighter series, and is simply not as fun. Next Generation also criticised the game's animations and backgrounds, stating they were not up to the franchise's usual standards. After the release of this game in 1996, in typical Street Fighter fashion, an arcade upgraded version of this game would see a release in the following year. This title, released on the 3rd of March 1997, allowed you to play as all of the hidden characters from the previous game instantly, and would add a further 4 hidden characters. The new lineup would even include Evil Ryu from the Street Fighter Alpha series, which is nice, I guess. As expected with this game, it would only be a matter of time until a Sony PlayStation version would be published, which is exactly what you would expect really, considering the game was programmed to run on Sony's ZN hardware, an arcade board based on the PlayStation to begin with. This version of the game, titled Street Fighter EX Plus Alpha, would arrive on the system on the 17th of July 1997 in Japan. This game would build on the roster count even further by introducing both Dalsim and Sakura to this spin-off of the franchise. Bonus stages including barrel smashing were also added to the title, all in all making this the most complete rendition in the series yet. The game certainly does not seem to be remembered by the masses to the same degree as Tekken, Soul Blade or even the Virtua Fighter series. So what was it about this game that prevented it from becoming the stuff of legends? Well, let's delve into some of the journalists' responses to this game at the time of release. GameSpot would state that this PlayStation game was a 3D Street Fighter game worthy of its heritage, but by the same token is perhaps too closely tied to its heritage. They felt that whilst the game had strong points, it was perhaps a stepping stone to a more impressive Street Fighter game yet to come. They gave the game some criticism, such as claiming the game doesn't attempt to be anything more than a juggling and combo-filled game like Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo, but with the play speed and graphical style of Namco's first Tekken game. What I guess they also meant by this was that the game was pretty dated in comparison to its 3D contemporaries, considering Tekken 3 was already out by this point. They would also complain about the game's lack of an attempt made to give the characters any true 3D movement. GameSpot was also uninspired by the game's characters, complaining that many of the new ones just mimicked old characters in some ways. In terms of the game's fighting mechanics, they would heavily talk about the game's heavy emphasis on offensive attacking as opposed to the more defensive functions found in previous iterations from the franchise. They would add Street Fighter EX Plus Alpha is not a game for turtlers, and not necessarily even a game for Street Fighter purists. This is now less of a game of strategy than it is a game of action, without a doubt. To keep the game flowing, Street Fighter EX Plus Alpha has reasonably forgiving controls that ease for chaining together of combos and execution of special attacks. The game's visuals and audio would both be praised, with of course the exception of many of the game's new character designs. They would close by summarising, taken as a whole, Street Fighter EX Plus Alpha is a fun game with great gameplay, better than average aesthetics and a large number of characters. As we've seen many, perhaps too many times before, Capcom has a tendency to use its good Street Fighter games as a foundation to build truly great ones. How long will Street Fighter EX Plus Alpha be worth playing? Your answer will depend upon how tired you are of traditional Street Fighter gameplay. As you can see, although sounding flawed in places, the opinion of this game, even by GameSpot, was all around pretty positive, but some of the best reception the game would receive was still to come. The UK PlayStation magazine stated, the gameplay is as recognisable as the Taj Mahal, and that it was the most fun we've ever had with Street Fighter since Turbo, giving the game a remarkable 10 out of 10. They concluded, this is like a second honeymoon, the true master of martial arts games remains unrivaled. IGN would build on this praise, stating, this is one of the best Street Fighters and I think it's a good switch. It's still a 2D fighter, but it looks a whole lot better. While the EX games do not get much love today, what may surprise you is that the home versions of this game sold over 400,000 copies, which is nothing in comparison to the over 20 million copies Street Fighter 2 sold, but over 5 times that of the 80,000 copies Street Fighter 3 and its iterations would later sell on the Dreamcast, all in all making the game moderately successful sales-wise. So from all of this, we can see that upon release, Street Fighter EX Plus Alpha received all round very favourable reviews. So with all of this in mind, it does not really clear up as to why the game has faded almost into the realms of being forgotten when compared to the rest of the series, which is shocking considering that the game was the first ever from the series to enter the world of polygons. So why does EX not get the same love as other entries from the franchise? Well, let's try and break it down. First off, of those selling poorly at the time, over the years Street Fighter 3 and its iterations have grown to become more and more appreciated. Not everyone may have owned a Dreamcast, people may have been tired of 2D gaming back then, and people weren't ready to move past their favourite characters from Street Fighter 2. But the timeless graphical style paired with a solid gameplay would turn it into a cult favourite later on. Even more so after Street Fighter 4 became a huge commercial success, and people wanted to go back and see what came before it. The Alpha series delivered much of the same, with although featuring more basic graphics, it featured everyone's favourite characters and then some, and the Capcom Vs series blew players' minds, allowing Street Fighters to face off with characters no one thought possible. The EX series on the other hand just isn't as well remembered as the above I've just mentioned, which wasn't helped by the fact that Namco's fighting games from the period overshadowed them. And as of today, Capcom's 2D offerings have aged better. Pair all this with the fact that it was developed by Arika and not Capcom, Arika would hold the rights to all the new characters who were creative of the EX series. Thus, they would not show up in later entries down the line, which if they had of, it would have helped solidify EX's legacy. For Skullomania lovers like myself though, we can enjoy playing as them today in Arika's own fighting game, Fighting EX3, which is nice, but it would certainly be more of a treat to see Skullomania in Street Fighter 6. Back in 1997 regarding Street Fighter EX, Ono would tell people to go and play the game, and when you actually play it, I think you'll get a very different impression of it than you get by watching from afar, a statement that is still very relevant in 2023. Whilst being overlooked today, no one can take away the simple fact that 400,000 copies of EX Plus Alpha were sold on the PlayStation, which paired with a positive critical response at the time from gaming publications, this altogether would guarantee that EX would receive multiple sequels. Which brings us on to the existence of its sequel, Street Fighter EX2. As for its release, the year is 1998, a golden era for fighting games and an especially monumental time for Capcom. The Street Fighter franchise and Capcom fighting games in general were at a height of their mass production, with back-to-back releases that continued to shape the genre. In June, Street Fighter Alpha 3 stormed onto the scene, delivering the most polished and expansive installment of the Alpha series yet, boasting an enhanced roster and refined gameplay that left players in awe. But before that, in January, Capcom dropped a bombshell with Marvel vs. Capcom Clash of the Superheroes, a wild boundary-pushing crossover where the Street Fighter cast joined forces with other Capcom legends to battle the mighty Marvel universe. Both games have become icons in the fighting game pantheon. Alpha 3 marked the triumphant crescendo of the Alpha saga, while Marvel vs. Capcom unleashed an electrifying blend of chaos and ambition, setting a new benchmark for crossover titles. Yet amidst these heavy hitters, another game quietly joined Capcom's 1998 lineup, one that dared to push the Street Fighter series in an entirely different direction. Enter Street Fighter EX2, the sequel to 1996's Street Fighter EX, a bold experiment that traded the franchise's signature 2D sprites for groundbreaking 3D polygon graphics. Like the last game, developed by Arika, a company helmed by Akira Nishitani, one of the creative forces behind Street Fighter 2, as already spotlighted, the original EX was Capcom's first foray into the realm of 3D fighting games. But what for its follow-up? Street Fighter EX2 arrived powered by the upgraded Sony ZN2 hardware. This new tech promised more horsepower, more spectacle, and a more refined experience. But the real questions are, did it deliver? Was it enough to elevate the EX series to greater heights? Let's dive in and start by examining this game's explosive introduction. From the very first frames of a game's intro, Street Fighter EX2 immediately flexes its graphical improvements. The once clunky polygons of its predecessor have been smoothed out, giving the visuals a more polished and refined look. A welcome evolution for fans of the series. The intro also teases players with glimpses of fresh faces who had never graced the EX lineup before, setting the stage for a roster packed with surprises. As outlined earlier, in true Street Fighter tradition, the first Street Fighter EX didn't settle for just one version. The original arcade release was followed by Street Fighter EX Plus, an upgraded arcade iteration, and later Street Fighter EX Plus Alpha, which took the game to new heights. Each upgrade brought with it an expanded roster, transforming the original lineup of 10 playable characters, plus 4 unlockables, into a robust cast of 23 fighters by the final version. Street Fighter EX2 kicks things off with a starting roster of 16 characters. The lineup includes many fan favourites from the first game, blending classic Street Fighter 2 icons with quirky and innovative characters developed by Arika. After all, you have to appreciate this game to some degree for simply bringing back Skullomania, the eccentric skeleton-suited hero who quickly became a cult favourite. Adding to the excitement, Street Fighter EX2 introduced new blood to the EX family. Familiar faces from the broader Street Fighter franchise, Blanca and Vega, make their grand debut into the EX universe, both showcased prominently in the game's intro. Joining them are 2 all-new challengers, Sharon, a deadly hit woman armed with a gun, and Hayate, a swift and elegant Japanese swordsperson. Together they brought fresh energy and unique styles to a game that already was shaping up to be a worthy successor. Street Fighter EX2 didn't just bring back familiar faces though, it continued to up the ante with hidden characters and surprises for players to uncover. Among the unlockable fighters, Garuda and Kairi make their return from the original game, adding a sense of continuity for longtime fans, where the real excitement lies in the fresh additions to the roster. Meet Shadowgeist, a masked vigilante whose dark persona evokes shades of the fan favourite Skullomania, as after all, for every hero there is a villain, where in darkness there is light, and vice versa. Building on newcomers, we have Nanase, a young and nimble staff wielder who brings a unique combat style to the mix. And then there's the ultimate prize for the most dedicated players, a secret character named Cycloid, reminiscent of Cycloid Beta from the previous game, but only accessible through a cheat code. When it comes to gameplay, Street Fighter EX2 sticks to the tried and tested formula of one-on-one battles fought over best of 3 rounds, a hallmark of the series. But while it adheres to the classic Street Fighter framework, the EX series sets itself apart with its own distinct fighting systems. These mechanics, introduced in the original EX game, blend influences from Street Fighter 2 and Street Fighter Alpha, creating a hybrid style that feels both familiar and innovative. Expect all the staples, special moves, super combos and fast-paced action that rewards skill and strategy. But wait, there's more. What's new in Street Fighter EX2 are some exciting tweaks to the gameplay systems. The introduction of the super meter gauge, now split into 3 sections, adds depth and flexibility to the combat. Players can unleash devastating techniques with greater precision, making meter management a more strategic element than ever before. Another standout feature is the return of the guard break, a series exclusive move designed to shatter a blocking opponent's defences. With one segment of the super meter, players can execute this powerful technique to stun their opponent, creating a prime opening for follow-up attacks. This differs from the guard break mechanic found in the Alpha series, which merely creates an opening. The EX series version leaves the opponent reeling, making it a more punishing and dynamic option. One of the standout mechanics of the Street Fighter EX series is super cancelling, which allows players to chain multiple super combos together for devastating show-stopping damage. It's a technique that rewards precision and timing, letting skilled players turn the tide of a match in an instant. But Street Fighter EX2 wasn't content to just rehash old features, it introduced a brand new gameplay innovation: XL combos. Similar to the custom combos in the other series, XL combos enable players to chain together basic and special moves in rapid succession for a limited time. The system has its nuances. Players can follow a basic move with another basic move or transition from a basic move into a special move, and then string that into a different special move. However, there are strict limitations. You can't repeat the same move within a combo, nor can you revert from a special move to a basic move. While intricate and challenging to master, this mechanic opens up a world of creative possibilities for those willing to dive deep into its complexities. So what sets Street Fighter EX2 apart from its predecessors? The upgrades may not reinvent the wheel, but they do bring some welcome enhancements. The game boasts more polished graphics, a retooled character roster, fresh stage backdrops, and of course the introduction of the XL combos. While the innovations are incremental rather than groundbreaking, they still elevate the experience, though it's clear that Street Fighter EX2 didn't aim to reinvent the series. Naturally, in true Street Fighter tradition, Capcom wasn't finished with just one version of EX2. As, after all, why would they settle for just one release when fighting games with slight tweaks and upgrades are a tried and true formula for easy cash grabs? And who could resist the allure of a profitable encore? Just 15 months after EX2 hit the arcade, Street Fighter EX2 Plus arrived with its own set of adjustments. Among the most notable changes was the roster shake-up. Hayate, who debuted in the original EX2, was swapped out for Nanase, formerly a secret character now front and centre on the player select screen. Additionally, M. Bison, Pullen Perna, and Darren, all absent from EX2 but beloved from the first EX game, made their triumphant returns. With these tweaks, Street Fighter EX2 ensured that fans had even more reason to keep coming back for another round. As always, Capcom knew how to keep the fight alive and the coins flowing. With Street Fighter EX2 Plus, the roster expanded further, introducing a mix of familiar faces and brand new contenders. Among the returning icons, Sagat made his debut in the Arika developed EX series, bringing his signature Muay Thai style to the 3D battlefield. But the real excitement came from the completely new characters. Volcano Rosso, a stylish and fiery Italian martial artist, and Aria, a quirky young girl sporting a massive mechanical right arm. These fresh additions added diversity to the lineup and brought some unique flair to the game. For those seeking an extra challenge, Bison 2, a non-selectable boss character, loomed large. Clad in a striking white uniform, this version of M. Bison came with an unlimited super meter and two terrifying variants of his Psycho Cannon super combo, which he could charge to twice their normal size. Facing off against this boss wasn't just a fight, it was a huge ordeal. The gameplay itself received a power boost with the introduction of Meteor combos, a new high-impact feature. Essentially an upgrade to super combos, Meteor combos could only be unleashed when all three sections of the super meter were filled. These devastating moves packed even more punch, and every character in the game had at least one Meteor combo in their arsenal, giving players something extra to strive for during matches. After its two arcade versions, Street Fighter EX2 Plus finally made the leap to home consoles, with a release on the Sony PlayStation. Arriving in Japan in December 1999 and rolling out globally in the year 2000, the PlayStation port brought the arcade action into players' living rooms. Alongside standard modes like Arcade, Versus and Practice, the console version introduced some unique extras. Satellite Smashing, a bonus minigame, added a bit of fun on the side, while Director's Mode allowed players to record their fighters' moves and edit them into a personalised highlight reel. As a special treat, Hayate, who had been cut from the arcade version of EX2 Plus, returned as a secret character for console players. While the EX2 series brought some new characters, gameplay mechanics and graphical updates to the table, it didn't stray far from the foundation laid by its predecessors. Some might call it refinement rather than reinvention, but how did the critics of the time feel about this final rendition of Street Fighter EX2? Let's take a look. When it comes to critical reception, Street Fighter EX2 Plus garnered mixed opinions from major outlets, reflecting both its strengths and limitations. GameSpot took a measured stance, noting that while EX2 Plus added a handful of new features and characters, it lacked the flair and excitement that made the original Street Fighter EX stand out. They highlighted the improved visuals, acknowledging the smoother, more polished look compared to the jagged but distinctive aesthetics of its predecessor. The upgraded effects, particularly during super combos, are a step forward, with explosions of energy lighting up the screen. However, despite these enhancements, GameSpot felt that EX2 Plus was more of a refined upgrade than a truly fresh experience. For players who had grown tired of the original, this sequel didn't offer enough to reignite their interest. Their verdict, while it looked good and played well, it failed to capture the originality and novelty of the first game. IGN, however, painted a far rosier picture, emphasising the game's graphics and how well it transitioned the iconic 2D Street Fighter formula into 3D. They praised EX2 as a shining example of how to bring a 2D franchise into the third dimension without losing its core appeal. According to IGN, EX2 stood out amongst 2D to 3D fighters as the most visually striking of its kind, with smooth textures and clean edges that demonstrated restraint and refinement. They appreciated how the game preserved the nuances of the classic Street Fighter experience, while introducing just enough innovation to feel fresh. Their enthusiasm culminated in a strong recommendation, urging players to pick up a copy and enjoy extended play sessions at home. Reflecting on IGN's review of Street Fighter EX2 Plus, it's fair to say they do have a point to some degree. The game's graphics were solid for their time, but let's be honest, with the clarity of hindsight, they've aged far less gracefully than the timeless visuals of games like Marvel vs. Capcom or Street Fighter Alpha 3. Those titles not only pushed boundaries but also left an indelible mark on the fighting game genre, making them far more likely to be celebrated and revisited today than EX2. In fact, both of those games just mentioned have featured in collections recently, so use my Instant Gaming affiliate link if you're interested in purchasing either of those. As for EX2, beyond its dated graphics, the very concept of Street Fighter EX2 feels less compelling when compared to its contemporaries. The Street Fighter franchise is filled with beautiful 2D games that define the genre and ambitious crossovers that united characters we never imagined sharing a single screen. In contrast, EX2, while competent, lacks that spark of innovation or cultural impact that makes a game unforgettable. While opinions varied, it's clear that Street Fighter EX2 Plus succeeded in building on its predecessor's foundations, even if it didn't quite hit the same high notes for everyone. Whether you saw it as a polished upgrade or a worthwhile evolution depended purely on your own expectations. However, while it does have its strengths and purpose, let's be honest, even within its own EX Trilogy, EX2 is arguably the least significant entry. Ultimately, Street Fighter EX2 has its merits, but it simply couldn't compete with the legacy and longevity of its peers. It remains an interesting chapter in the franchise's history, worth a look, but not one that stands shoulder to shoulder with the giants of 1998. But this was far from the end of the EX series.
The third game in the series, Street Fighter EX3, would arrive another 2 years later in the year 2000. We have a lot to talk about this game, so to get you in the mood, let me show you the game's introduction. From the game's introduction, you would have instantly noticed that graphically, the visuals in the game were a massive step up from Street Fighter EX2, and the duel that ensues between Ken and Ryu looks graphically much more impressive than ever before. When it comes to Street Fighter games being presented in the third dimension, this was the best the brand had looked as of yet. But EX3 offered way more than simply graphical improvements. As you can see from the character select screen, the game features a sizable roster of fighters with a lot of different characters to choose from. Including unlockables, this game features a whopping 28 different fighters total, which is a decent amount. Like previous EX games, the characters mix a range of fighters from classic Street Fighter games together with a bunch of characters created by Arika for the series. This of course includes everybody's favourite Arika fighter, Skullomania, a man who, as you know, I simply can't get enough of. Outside of just the graphical improvements, the title also marked a number of changes for the series, the first of which being the fact that we mentioned it being released on the Sony PlayStation 2, which straight away explains the huge graphical improvements over the game's predecessors. Perhaps more interestingly, unlike other fighting games I've covered on this channel, this game isn't exclusive and only appeared on the PS2 and no other platforms. In fact, even more surprisingly, the game did not even see an arcade release, meaning that this was the first game featuring Street Fighter characters that could only be experienced in the home. I guess this was because by the time the PS2 was launched, arcades were slowly becoming less and less relevant, and Sony was set to make so much money with the PS2. It could be argued that them bothering with arcade hardware at that time would have been a trivial pursuit at best in comparison. Still though, while this was the case, Capcom fighters that year remained in arcades, with Marvel vs Capcom 2 and Capcom vs SNK both seeing release on the Sega Dreamcast arcade counterpart, the Sega Naomi, around the time frame. The Dreamcast really was the last console ever made that featured the old school mentality of bringing the arcade experience home. In that regard, you've got to love that system. With regards to EX3 though, despite its graphical differences, like other titles in the series, the game is yet another 2D head-to-head fighting game. The game would see release in Japan in March of the year 2000, October 2000 as a North American launch title, and the game would reach Europe in March of 2001. Whilst graphics in the game have been massively improved, many of the mechanics found in Street Fighter EX2 had been directly carried over to this game. This meant that both super combos and meteor combos made a return, but there are still some differences. A big change, for example, is that guard breaks had been completely removed from the EX franchise, and instead a similar system known as surprise blows had been added in its place. The game also featured momentary combos, which enabled combinations or moves to be started, switched and restarted kind of like a super cancel. Many characters also had new moves, including Skullomania, who now had a vertical projectile, meaning there was a fair share of new features for experienced players to sink their teeth into. The game's main play mode is known as Original Mode and is drastically different from anything found in either of the previous EX games. After selecting a character, you quickly find yourself in a 3-on-1 encounter, an interesting concept which I'm surprised took this long to be placed within a Street Fighter game. After winning this bout, you then earn the opportunity to recruit one of your former opponents to your team, which means, you guessed it, the game features traditional tag team action. Teddy Long would be proud. Holla holla holla. There is no doubt that tag team fighting was getting hot within the fighting game genre during this period. The Capcom Versus series, for example, was in full swing, and by this point, rival schools had received moderate success too, so I guess it just made sense to add this feature into Street Fighter EX3. In terms of a tag feature, the game introduces a mechanic known as the Critical Parade, which consists of your tag team partner battling your opponent simultaneously for a few seconds upon calling upon them, a rule taken straight from the Pro Wrestling Tag Team playbook. It's also worth mentioning that when experiencing Original Mode, after every encounter you have the opportunity to recruit opponents and can recruit up to 3 different partners as you make progress through this 6-bout quest. These fights are a mixture of different stipulation matches, from tag team bouts to team battles, and as mentioned earlier, even 2-on-1 and 3-on-1 matches. The variation from encounter to encounter makes me wonder whether the Street Fighter EX3 team took inspiration from the success of Super Smash Bros. On the Nintendo 64, which had been released in the previous year of 1999. Adding to fun features, the final stage of Original Mode places you in a 1-on-1 encounter with classic Street Fighter II boss M. Bison. Upon defeating him though, the end credits themselves deliver a slice of uniqueness by acting as a sort of bonus stage, if you will. As the credits roll, you are rewarded with an infinite combo meter and have the opportunity to take down as many weak generic fighters as possible. In fact, 6 or 7 of these are normally on screen against you at the same time, leaving plenty of room for some chaotic fun here. Within Original Mode, there are also secondary objectives, which the player can complete in order to gain platinum, gold, silver and bronze trophies, which in turn unlock various features. These additional challenges give the game an element of single-player replayability that was not necessarily there with the first 2 games in the series. Aside from the Original Mode, other fighting modes in the game allow you to set up tag matches, team battles and even 4-player matches at will, allowing for a lot of options, especially when indulging in multiplayer fun. Outside of all of these play modes, the other standout feature to the game is the character edit mode, which is an extension to the game's expert mode, a play mode that had appeared in the first EX games previously. In this mode you play as Ace, a fairly generic looking fighter who is somewhat of a blank slate in that he has no special moves whatsoever. Special moves and super combos are required for Ace as you progress through this play mode. The moves can be purchased through the use of points, which are earned by completing achievement-like tasks, such as performing a 3-hit combo or executing a combo that does over 90 points of damage. Ace is a playable character in other modes in the game and becomes more and more useful depending on how much you have been grinding within this section of the game. So, as you can see from what we have covered so far, it looks like at the very least Arika were attempting to make an effort with the EX series, and attempted to do things with the game they had not tried out previously. Now, with this knowledge in mind, it might have you wondering how those who did play this game perceived it at the time, so let's check out the critical response from the period. GameSpot would be fairly critical of the game, stating that Street Fighter EX3 takes the gameplay and additional moves of EX2, adds a tag team element similar to that of Capcom's own Marvel vs. Capcom, and drops it onto the PlayStation 2 for a quick and dirty fighting game that seems a little rushed but still manages to be a lot of fun. While the character graphics used in EX3 look pretty amazing when standing still, the animation is the same as it was in EX2. Granted, you can't exactly add lots of frames to all the special moves, and keep the game's timing as faithful to the Street Fighter series as 3 is. But now that the 3D Street Fighters don't look all blocky and pixelated, the jerky animation really stands out. It wouldn't just be the look of the game that GameSpot would be unimpressed with either, as they would also take pot shots at the sound, adding, the music doesn't always fit the action. Also, in an annoying demonstration of audio streaming, the music changes tunes on the fly when other characters get tagged in, so you never listen to one song for long. One track fades into another as soon as the action on the screen dictates a change. But amongst their critique, there would be a dash of praise too, when they would comment that Street Fighter EX3 is the game that EX2 should have and probably would have been had this kind of hardware power been available sooner. The tag team fighting adds a nice new element that the previous game totally lacked. EX3 may feel a bit rushed in some spots, but overall it's a fun and great looking fighting game that won't disappoint long-time EX fans. So as you can see, GameSpot had some mixed thoughts on the game, generally praising the gameplay mechanics, but criticising the animation and music. All in all, resulting in them giving a pretty average score of 7.4 out of 10 for the game. IGN's perspective of the title though was even more negative, with them stating in their opening paragraph that Street Fighter EX3 comes with little fanfare. It's a mixed bag of good multiplayer action and a few luscious special effects, but uninspired basic combat coupled with stiff controls. It's certainly not the best of the series. In a nutshell, EX3 is 3D Street Fighter with tag team combat and multiplayer capabilities. The game uses some of the PlayStation 2's massive polygonal power, but rarely ever scratches the surface. Even though it's probably the best looking of the 3 in the series, EX3 simply feels rushed, uninspired and downright mediocre. Although players might be instantly dazzled with the size and look of the Street Fighter characters, once you take a good look at them, the honeymoon quickly ends. Simple shaded characters that depend on boxy frames and bright colours simply don't do the imaginative former 2D characters any justice. All in all, Street Fighter EX3 keeps the tradition going, but not at its peak. Character response time isn't great. Even with the power of the PS2, it seems that the response time in a game such as Street Fighter Alpha 3 is better. The characters are all stiff and mechanical in movement. With the increased technical features of the PS2, most people would conclude that lightning quick movement and blindingly fast attacks would make this Street Fighter the best in the EX series. But that's far from the case. The character design and overall level of detail leaves much to be desired too. In the end, Street Fighter EX3 is a middle of the road fighter that lacks pizzazz and inspiration. By this point you might think that it was all bad news for EX3, but some reception elsewhere for the game was more pleasant than what IGN brought to the table, with game critics stating that it had a group of pleasantly complex battlers that are very distinct in both visual and play design. Adding variety and flavour to the mix, the variances in philosophy and conceptualisation are extremely refreshing. Adding that, the interestingly offbeat touches are far superior to the dull and ugly side of the spectrum found in Street Fighter 3. CNET would add that the tag team fighting adds a nice new element that the previous game totally lacked. EX3 may feel a bit rushed in some spots, but overall it's a fun and great looking fighting game that won't disappoint. So from all of this, as you can see, opinions were fairly mixed on the quality of Street Fighter EX3. The game certainly has its pros and cons to it, however aside from everything else, I think there is one major reason that few people remember playing this game. Aside from the fact that there were probably over 20 fighting games that contained Street Fighter characters by this point in time, and people were generally a bit fed up with Street Fighter by the year 2000, the game was massively overshadowed by others, with one game in particular taking away its spotlight, which we will get to in a minute. But EX3 lacked in popularity due to more factors than competition from competing companies. One of these barriers the game faced could be argued came from the fact that the Street Fighter diehard fans had generally found a deep appreciation for Street Fighter 3 Third Strike, Marvel vs Capcom 2 and Capcom vs SNK by that point. All great fighting games with 2D graphics that offered a quick response time for competitive play. So what was left of a Street Fighter fandom by that point had moved on to those games. Compounding issues, the fact that Street Fighter now had 3D graphics had already had its wow moment with the release of the first EX game. So all this game really had that was new to the public was 3D Street Fighter with tag team mechanics. The big issue here though was that if someone wanted a great fighting game that offered 3D polygons and tag team action, EX3 wasn't the game that PlayStation 2 prospective buyers were excited about. That hype existed around Tekken Tag Tournament. As mentioned multiple times before on this channel, the PlayStation brand was the most popular entity in console gaming during the era, and the Tekken franchise was the most popular fighting game brand with the mass public over the period too. This meant that when Joe Public picked up a PS2 for the first time, they were highly likely to pick up Tekken Tag Tournament with it. When we bear in mind this was still a period when most gamers' collections were significantly smaller than today, most people were not interested in procuring more than one new fighting game at a time. So Street Fighter EX3 was left on shelves, in place of a much more desirable Tekken game. Apart from being a more popular brand at the time, the new Tekken game got better review scores across the board in EX3 as well, so the game was outmatched and outperformed on every level, finally bringing the run of Street Fighter EX games to a close. Still, the game does some interesting things and was certainly the best looking 3D Street Fighter game up until that point. However, with there being a constant glut of Capcom fighting games for over a decade solid, the mass public seemed to be tired of the Street Fighter brand and were no longer hungry for new entries. Anecdotes suggest that moving into the next few years, many believed at Capcom that there would never be a new numerical entry in the Street Fighter series, due to oversaturation completely burning the name out. So while we can't really be sure that EX3 was the title that broke the camel's back, there was certainly not a demand for games like that anymore. So therefore it served as perfect evidence to Capcom as to why it wasn't worth making more Street Fighters. Eventually we would of course receive Street Fighter 4, which ironically would be created due to Street Fighter 2 nostalgia kicking in, with the game picking up steam via Xbox Live. For Arika though, they too somewhat returned to form, with beloved characters such as Skullomania returning in their 2018 game Fighter EX3, which is the spiritual successor to Street Fighter EX3. During the years they actively developed the original EX games, they also developed another lesser talked about fighting game called Fighting Layer. Released in 1998, this game, published by Namco, featured 3D fighting gameplay similar to their Street Fighter games, and included mechanics like cancelling supers into other supers and universal guard break attacks. In addition to its unique roster of fighters, Arika specifically chose to include two Street Fighter EX characters, Alan Snyder and Blair Dame, tying the Street Fighter EX series and Fighting Layer together. While both these often overlooked brands remained dormant for many years, after the failure of Street Fighter EX3, as time passed, Arika eventually made the bold decision to release a brand new fighting game that combined Fighting Layer and the EX series into one brand. Known as Fighting EX3, this epic new fighter featured Skullomania and company in their first appearance in 18 years. This was a great time to be an EX fan, but the road to how we got here was far from simple. What makes this story all the more noteworthy is that, interestingly, in the long gap between the demise of the original EX games and this new one, Arika had been pitching multiple ideas to try to get Capcom to greenlight a new Street Fighter EX game. Reportedly, they were pretty far into trying to make this happen, and at one point they even created a working demo for the Nintendo 3DS, but Capcom rejected every pitch. So next time you feel like complaining that there is no way to play a Skullomania on the 3DS, you know we only have Capcom to blame for this. I guess it must have simply got to the point where Arika lost their patience and just said, fine, we're going to make our own EX game then, with blackjack and hookers.
Screw the whole thing.
And they did. So in early 2017, Arika released a trailer showcasing a new EX fighting game they had created to release themselves, which they had made using Unreal Engine 4. This news would turn out to be so awesome that many EX fans struggled to digest that this was really happening, with many speculating that the EX comeback was just a cruel joke. After all, it was quickly noted by fighting game fans that the trailer aired on April the 1st, making many believe it was an elaborate April Fool's Day prank. While the date indeed lined up for this, unfortunately the video's description confirmed the news nobody wanted, with it stating these are April Fool's stories and not being officially considered for release at this stage. So even if you contact the official Arika Corporation, there's nothing you can do at this time. While no official new EX game had been announced, it seemed like Arika may have used this joke as an opportunity to see how much interest there was for a new EX title, as the positive response to the trailer led Arika to decide to turn their so-called joke into a full game. Surely this was all just a clever way of generating hype. As this emerging story continued to unfold, Arika soon released another trailer with the message Arika has decided to begin development on a PlayStation 4 version of the mysterious fighting game title Undecided, and make a public announcement on the final day of EVO 2017. This game will be the newest entry in the EX series. What a time this was to be alive! The game so many had dreamed of was officially confirmed at the fighting game event, and Arika would continue to develop the self-funded fighting game. Head of Arika, Akira Nishitani, noted that the company had just enough funds to complete the project without external help, admitting that the new EX game was primarily a passion project. However, his goal was still to create a new fighting game that kept the company financially healthy. In November 2017, the game's title, Fighter EX3, was finally revealed, and a public beta featuring 6 playable characters was made available for download on the PlayStation 4 on December 11, 2017, and ran for 2 weeks. The developers used the beta to test online connectivity and gather player feedback. The finished game was made available for purchase on the PS4 in June of 2018, available in 2 variants, a standard edition and a lower priced light version with fewer features. Over time, the light version was phased out, leaving the standard version as the sole consumer option. Initially, the game debuted with a small roster selection, with online play being the main attraction. However, 2 weeks after the release, Arika announced a free arcade mode update, available 1 month after the game's launch. During EVO 2018, Arika also announced that Pull and Perna and Rosso from Street Fighter EX would be made available as free updates in September, with more characters added via free updates as the game was gradually fleshed out. Additionally, years before Street Fighter 6 opted to do exactly the same thing, SNK's Terry Bogard was added to the game as a paid downloadable character, making his debut in an EX game. This man sure gets around, doesn't he? In terms of gameplay, Fighter EX3 retained many of the mechanics from Arika's earlier fighting games, such as super cancels, juggling and more, all made possible using the game's 6-button layout. In terms of gameplay, movement was faster than ever before, thanks to a new dash feature, allowing for more responsive movement than in previous Arika games. GameSpot noted that the gameplay in EX3 was heavily defined by 2 mechanics: the ability to chain attacks into specials and super moves, and cancel mid-air combos. EX3 had an edge over many other fighting games in terms of how smooth and free-flowing the cancelling felt, leading to spectacular combos involving multiple specials and super skills executed in quick succession. The game's fantastic implementation of cancelling, combined with the great dash movement, made the gameplay as fluid as one could possibly want. Building on refinement, a new feature to the EX series in this entry was the inclusion of Goji boosts, or however that is pronounced, a system that allowed for enhancements and bonuses during matches. A Goji is a pre-constructed deck of 5 special skills that can be activated when certain conditions are met in a bout. The enhancements from these can lead to benefits like increased movement speed. The skills found in each Goji deck are designed to complement each other. GameSpot noted that the Infinity deck contained 3 boosts for building super meters and 2 other skills that used this extra meter, allowing for rapid meter building and spending. While some of these decks are more useful than others, and some require a lot of trial and error to master, but can add a nice touch to the overall experience. Unlike many other fighting games developed by major studios, arguably Fighter EX3 was an independent project. Its successful release demonstrated the potential for smaller developers to make a mark in the fighting game world, which is often dominated by big names like Capcom and Bandai Namco. In many ways, Fighter EX3 was a dream come true for hardcore competitive fighting gamers. The game boasts a roster of cult favourites and featured a combat system that encouraged experimentation and technical mastery. Critics generally praised its gameplay, although some wished for a larger roster and more single-player content. PlayStation Universe highlighted the game's appeal, stating, "The game is a deeply engaging fighter that resurrects the Street Fighter EX combat mechanics of yesteryear. Fighting EX Layer's lack of single-player content unfortunately makes it difficult to recommend to those not deeply engaged in its online multiplayer shenanigans. However, those who are will find much to enjoy." Gamers Heroes noted, while Fighting EX Layer doesn't offer a plethora of options or fighters, it is packed with heart. A lot of effort went into its design, and those looking for a fighter that stands out should dive into mastering its unique system. ZTGD expressed enthusiasm for the game, saying, "For those who grew up with Arika's work, Fighting EX Layer is pure joy to play. I hope they continue to support the game and add more content as it goes on." Destructoid's review was more reserved, with one journalist stating, "As someone who has been playing fighters for nearly 3 decades, I can get on board with Fighting EX Layer's lack of pageantry. What I can't accept as easily is its lack of roster and playstyle diversity. The foundation is there, it just needs to be built up further." Finally, GameSpot praised the game, commenting, "On a pure gameplay level, Fighting EX Layer is an absolute treat. What it lacks in bells and whistles, it delivers in pure fun combat. This is a game made for the sort of players who will spend hours perfecting an impractical, extremely precise combo in training mode simply for the satisfaction of having done it. If that describes you, then Fighting EX Layer will be worth everything you put into it." It's still incredibly exciting to me that Arika brought us a 4th installment in the EX series, a whopping 18 years after the last entry, and this time without Capcom's publishing help. It was a blast from the past to see the EX fighters return after all of these years. The game feels like Street Fighter EX4 in all but name, with a roster of beloved characters to prove it. Since the launch of Fighting EX Layer, the EX brand has been revitalized in some surprising ways. This has included the debut of a female version of Skullomania in SNK Heroines Tag Team Frenzy, and even the inclusion of Fighting EX Layer costumes in Street Fighter V. The Capcom Arika crossover collaboration returned, at least to some extent. The return of the EX series marked an exciting chapter in recent gaming history, bringing renewed attention to the EX legacy that had been mostly overlooked up until then. Watching Skullomania and the rest of the crew rise like a phoenix was thrilling, leaving us all eagerly anticipating what's next for these underappreciated fighters. Could some of them finally emerge as Street Fighter 6 characters in the future? Only time will tell, I guess. If this video sparked joy in your heart, make sure you subscribe, as I have hundreds of retrospectives like this on my channel. Also, don't forget you can get up to 90% off of thousands of games using my links, which can save you big money if, like myself, you like to try out a lot of different titles. If you don't know where to start, I'll also post a video link showing off some of the cheapest fighting games I've found on there. Happy shopping. Cheerio.